She covered the bed of a dry river with tarp. Everyone mocked her until the rain came. Sarah Miller was 42 years old, carrying a debt at the general store that grew each month with interest she could barely keep up with. 3 scrawny cows left from a herd that had once supported a family and hired hands, and an idea that the neighbors in Clear Springs quickly decided to call madness. She hadn't asked anyone for approval. She had woken up one sweltering night, stared at the wooden ceiling of her room for a long time, and before the sun had even appeared on the horizon, she was already rousing her 15-year-old son to help her carry the rolls of black tarp she had bought with the last dollars she had saved in a cookie tin in the kitchen cabinet. It was on a Tuesday morning, when the sun was already beating down hard and dust rose with every gust of hot wind, that the folks in the neighborhood began to stop by the side of the road. Sarah was on her knees in the dry bed of the creek that had cut through the Miller family property for over 60 years, spreading the heavy black tarp with her own hands over the soil cracked into 1,000 pieces, as if she were covering an old wound. And back there, leaning on the wooden fence post at the property line, with his arms crossed and his straw hat tilted to one side, Mr. Arthur Sterling watched everything with that smile he didn't even try to hide. Sarah didn't look up. She kept pressing the edge of the tarp into the ground with her work-worn hands, while the farmer's low laughter echoed across the clearing, as if the silence of the drought needed one more heavy thing to bear. No one there at that moment could have imagined what that tarp was about to change. The drought in Clear Springs had started 14 months earlier, in the treacherous way the drylands sometimes uses, the one that seems like a drizzle and turns into punishment. The first months were hard but not hopeless. The drylands were like that, and the elders in the community said they had seen worse. Only this time the rain didn't return. By the 7th month, the reservoir that was the pride of the community had begun to drop in a way that scared even those not used to being scared by anything. By the 10th month, the creek that had given the place its name had turned into a scar of sand and grey stone, and the spring that bubbled from a rock in the bottom of the bed vanished as if it had never existed. By the 12th month, the first families began to tie up their belongings and leave with the expression of someone apologizing to the land as they abandon it. Sarah had inherited the property 2 years before, when her father, Mr. Samuel Miller, was taken by a heart condition that the doctors at the local health clinic in the county seat hadn't detected in time. It was a small but honest inheritance. 42 acres, a brick house with a clay tile roof that her father had renovated bit by bit over decades, a wooden shed that creaked in the wind, an artesian well that had dried up along with everything else, and a tradition of hard work planted into that land inch by inch. Sarah knew every inch of it. She knew where the soil was darker after a brief rain, where the umbu tree grew that her father had preserved, saying that tree was wiser than any man, where the armadillo tracks appeared when the early morning was cold. That land wasn't just an asset she needed to protect. It was her father continuing to exist in some way. The problem was that Mr. Samuel, who had been a man of work but not paperwork, had left behind a debt at the general store of Silas Vance, the merchant in the county seat who had lent provisions and seed on credit for years, always confident that the harvest would pay everything off later. But the previous drought had eaten into the harvest, and old Mr. Miller had passed before settling what he owed. When Sarah signed the inventory, she signed that debt along with it, and Silas Vance, who had been patient with the father for years, made it clear that with the daughter things would work differently. It had been on an afternoon in March, still early in the drought, that he had shown up at the property with a notebook under his arm and a businesslike expression Sarah had never seen on him before, because before he was just Silas from the general store, who sold dried meat and weighed beans on an old scale. Mr. Samuel was good people, Sarah. A man of his word, he had said, sitting in the porch chair her father used every evening. But what he left here is a problem with a name and a price, and I need a concrete answer before the end of the year. Sarah had served coffee without answering, staring into the bottom of her cup as if the answer were in there. I'll pay, Silas, I just need time. Time is what the drought won't let us have, woman. Caleb, the 15-year-old son who had grown faster than any boy should have to grow, helped carry the rolls of tarp that Tuesday morning without asking too many questions. He was a young man of average height for his age, with the dark, curly hair inherited from his father's side, his mother's deep-set eyes, and the quiet way of processing everything before reacting that Sarah had learned to respect. He had woken without complaint when she knocked on his bedroom door at 4:30 in the morning, dressed in silence, eaten 2 slices of bread with butter standing in the kitchen, and gone out with her to load the old pickup without asking if this would work. Asking if something would work was a luxury for those who had other options. As the two of them unrolled the first tarp on the dry creek bed, the sun had already moved from a good morning position to a warning one. That yellow in the dry lands, that means the cool hours are over, and what's coming next is serious. "How far does this piece go?" Caleb asked, pointing along the bed. "To that bend," Sarah replied, gesturing with her chin toward a spot about 30 yards ahead, where the bed curved slightly left. "Then we turn, and the natural slope of the land will carry the water straight to the cistern." "What cistern?" "The one we're digging this weekend." Caleb stood still for a second with the tarp roll in his hand, looking at his mother with that expression of someone doing the math and not liking the result. "Do we have shovels for that?" "We have 2, and you have arms." He nodded in a gesture that mixed resignation with something that might have been trust, and went back to unrolling the tarp over the cracked earth. Sarah watched her son for a moment, before lowering her head and continuing to work. There was something in him that she sometimes couldn't look at for long without feeling her chest tighten. An old seriousness that didn't belong at 15, and that she knew she had placed there without meaning to, in the days when there was no choice but to work and push forward. It was at that moment that Mr. Arthur Sterling stopped at the boundary post. Arthur was 62 years old, owned a property nearly 10 times larger than the Millers, had inherited everything from his father and grandfather without having to build anything on his own, and carried that fact inside him as if it were proof of competence. He was a man who confused what he had received with what he had achieved, and that mistake had made him arrogant in a way he himself didn't notice. Always in a wide-brimmed straw hat, thick fabric pants, and an expression that seemed to say the world had been created to confirm what he already thought before he arrived. "What do you think you're doing there, Sarah?" he called out, loud enough for anyone passing on the dirt road to hear. She didn't answer right away. She kept pressing the edges of the tarp down with the stones she'd picked out to hold the borders in place. "I'm working, Mr. Arthur." "Working," he repeated, as if the word needed to be savored before it was swallowed. "A tarp won't make it rain, woman." "I know that. A tarp collects rain when it comes. That's different." There was a pause where a smile could fit. Sarah felt his gaze run the length of the black tarp with that expression of someone who's sure they're right before they even need to prove it to anyone. "And if the rain doesn't come, then we'll think of something else." Arthur let out a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a cough, slapped his open palm on the fence post as if closing the matter, and walked off down the dirt path that led back toward his property. Caleb looked at his mother. She didn't lift her head. There was a firmness in her shoulders that the boy had learned to recognize over the past few months. It wasn't anger, it was the focus of someone who had decided not to let anything change the course of what she was doing. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. That day's work lasted from morning until early afternoon. When they finished securing the last stretch of tarp with stones at the edges, both of them were drenched in sweat and covered in red dust. Sarah stood still for a moment at the end of the dry creek bed, looking at that entire length of black plastic, gleaming in the sun like a dark ribbon in the middle of the open field. Up close, it seemed like a simple idea. From afar, she knew it looked like madness. Caleb stood beside her looking at the same thing. "And now we wait?" he asked. "Now we dig the cistern," she replied, and went to fetch the shovels from the shed. The news that Sarah Miller had covered the creek bed with black tarp spread through Clear Springs faster than any other news had spread in a long time. In a place where the drought had wiped out nearly all good conversation, this became the talk of porches and the general store's tables. Most spoke with that tone people use when they don't want to be cruel, but can't hide that they find it funny. A tone of pity mixed with disbelief, like when someone tells you they saw a person trying to fix a rusty car with duct tape. Mrs. Beatrice, who lived in the third house down the road and had been a friend of Sarah's mother for decades, mentioned to her neighbor that the girl had been lost ever since losing her father, and that sometimes grief did that to a person, leaving them in a place where reality got twisted. The neighbor agreed, and they both shook their heads with the kind of compassion that doesn't fix anything. Over at the general store, where Silas Vance had a habit of letting news ferment before acting on it, the topic arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. Mr. Arthur had stopped by for a cold soda and had told what he'd seen, adding details that grew with each retelling. When he finished, Silas was silent for a moment, wiping the counter with a damp cloth at a slowness that signaled he was thinking. "How much does she owe here again?" he asked, without lifting his eyes from the counter. "That's your problem, isn't it?" Arthur replied with a smirk. "It's just that if she's spending what she has on tarps instead of paying what she owes, that tells me something." "Tells you what?" Silas folded the cloth, placed it under the counter, and looked at the farmer with that expression of someone who doesn't need to finish the sentence, because they're both thinking the same thing. The days that followed were filled with a tension Sarah felt on her skin like a second drought, this one from the inside. She kept working the property, waking before the sun, checking the edges of the tarp that the wind would lift from time to time, tending to the 3 cows that remained, and spending parts of her nights studying the irrigation pamphlets she had borrowed from the clinic's resource library in the county seat, old booklets with drawings of how water moved through the soil, how it could be guided, how a simple collection system could turn a weak rain into something usable. She had read those pamphlets so many times that the pages had gone soft at the folds. Caleb at first had helped without many words, which was his way of taking part in things. But one afternoon, when the two of them were digging the hole for the cistern, and the sun was already going down, he stopped, rested the shovel on his shoulder, and stared at his mother with that look of someone who's finally about to say, "What's been bottled up for too long?" "Mom, are you sure this is going to work?" Sarah kept digging for 2 or 3 strikes before answering. "No." Caleb kept looking at her. "But you're still doing it. When you're sure about every single thing you need to do in life, let me know. Until then, you work with what you've got." He stayed quiet for a moment and then went back to digging. But there was something different in the way he held the shovel after that conversation, a certainty that Sarah noticed without commenting. 2 days after the tarp was fully set up, Silas Vance showed up at the property. He hadn't sent word, hadn't given any notice. He arrived in his pickup, stopped in front of the gate, and kept honking until Sarah came out of the house. She came drying her hands on a dish towel, looking at him without rushing her steps. "Good afternoon, Silas." "Good afternoon." He got out of the pickup with the ledger under his arm and an envelope in his hand. "I brought you an offer." "An offer for what?" "A purchase." He looked at the property with that expression people use when they're trying to seem neutral but are clearly sizing things up with their eyes. "With the drought the way it is, the land here has lost a lot of value, but I'm willing to pay what it's worth today, already deducting what you owe me. It would be a good way out for you." Sarah took the envelope from his hands, opened it calmly, read it slowly, and folded it back. The amount written there was less than half of what the land was worth before the drought. It was the kind of offer that only makes sense for someone who's in over their head. "No, Silas." "Sarah." "No. But thank you for coming all this way." She handed the envelope back and headed back into the house. Silas stood by the pickup for a moment, with the look of someone who hadn't expected that. Then he slapped the envelope against his thigh, climbed into the pickup, and drove off, kicking up dust on the road. Caleb had seen everything from the kitchen window. When his mother came back, the two of them were silent for a moment. "He'll be back," Caleb said. "He will." "And then?" "And then the answer will be the same." The boy nodded, but in his eyes there was a doubt he wasn't voicing out loud, a doubt Sarah also carried, and that didn't have an easy answer. If the tarp didn't work, if it didn't rain, if Silas came back with something more than an offer, what would be left to say no with? It was in the midst of this quiet tension that, one afternoon the following week, Mrs. Martha Miller's pickup stopped in front of Sarah's gate. Mrs. Martha was 68 years old, her white hair pinned up in a firm bun, a straight posture that the decades hadn't managed to bend, and the same dark eyes her daughter had inherited, only with a different history behind them. She lived in a small town 2 hours from Clear Springs, had left there when she became a widow to Mr. Samuel Miller, and had built a small but orderly life in that other town, with a vegetable garden out back and a quilting group on Tuesdays. She hadn't promised she would come. She just showed up. Sarah watched her climb down from the pickup truck with a medium-sized suitcase and stood on the porch not quite sure what to feel. Their relationship had never been simple. Mrs. Martha was a woman of steady love but difficult expression, the kind of person who shows care through unsolicited advice and criticisms that always start with, "I don't mean to be harsh, but..." With her father alive, the two had found a balance. After he was gone, the balance had vanished along with him. "Mom," Sarah said, walking down the porch steps, "I didn't know you were coming." "Beatrice called me," Mrs. Martha replied, handing over the suitcase without much ceremony. "Said you'd lost your mind and that someone needed to do something." Sarah took the suitcase and took a deep breath. "Beatrice is well informed." "Is Beatrice right?" "About what?" "About the Tarp, Sarah. About that business you've done down at the creek. You can leave the suitcase in the back room, Mom." Mrs. Martha walked into the house with the look of someone who knew the conversation wasn't over and had only just begun. And indeed, that first night, after dinner of beans and rice and the cup of tea Sarah served, her mother started talking with that dangerous calm that was worse than yelling. "Your father was like that too," she said, facing the cup on the kitchen table. "Stubborn, firm. He thought he could handle everything on his own, and he suffered his whole life for it." "Dad built this land from scratch," Sarah replied without raising her eyes from the table, "and he struggled from scratch to the end." Mrs. Martha paused. "Selling isn't failure, my dear, it's starting over. Some people start over more than once in life and end up fine." "I know they do. Then why don't you—" "Because I'm not those people, Mum. I am this land. This land is Dad, and as long as I have a way to hold on, I'm going to hold on." Mrs. Martha looked at her daughter for a long moment, with that expression that mixed pride and pain in a way only mothers know. Then she got up, took the cup to the sink, washed it in silence, and went to bed without saying another word. Sarah sat at the kitchen table for a while longer, staring into space, and then went to bed knowing that neither of them had slept well that night. In the morning, before Mrs. Martha woke up, Sarah was already at the creek bed adjusting a part of the tarp that the wind had lifted during the night. Caleb followed with larger stones he had set aside the day before, specifically for that purpose, because he had noticed that the smaller stones weren't holding well at the edges when the wind blew from the north. They worked in silence for an hour side by side, and in that silence there was a conversation that needed no words. When they went back to the house, Mrs. Martha was in the kitchen making coffee. She looked at the tarp in the distance through the kitchen window, stared for a moment with that expression Sarah couldn't decipher, and then poured 3 cups without a comment. The days that followed had a routine that seemed calm but wasn't. Sarah and Caleb worked on the property all day, fixing what the drought had broken, taking care of what was left, checking the tarp. Mrs. Martha stayed home during the morning and gradually, without announcing it, began helping with what was needed in a kitchen and a house, sweeping the yard, washing clothes, making lunch appear on the table when the other two came in from the field. There wasn't much conversation about Sarah's decision. There was a kind of unspoken truce where each let the other exist as they were. But in town, things were moving in a way Sarah still didn't know about. There was an afternoon, in the week Mrs. Martha arrived, when Silas Vance and Mr. Arthur Sterling met at the general store. It wasn't the first time they had met, but it was the first time they had talked behind a closed door, something Mrs. Beatrice, who had passed by on the sidewalk outside, had noticed without going in. When they came out, the two of them wore a different expression from when they had gone in, the look of people who had left a meeting with a plan. What Sarah didn't know was that Mrs. Martha had gone to the general store that same afternoon to buy sugar and coffee, because Sarah had forgotten to restock the pantry and had arrived at the store just before the two men came out. Mrs. Martha had sat on the wooden bench outside, waiting for the door to be opened, because the custom there was for the store to close its interior when there was a meeting, and while she waited, She had heard through the side window that was left ajar because of the heat, enough to understand what was being arranged. She bought the sugar and the coffee, walked back to her daughter's property carrying the bag, and spent the entire walk home thinking. When she arrived, Sarah was in the shed fixing a hinge on the gate. Mrs. Martha went straight to the shed without stopping to leave the bag in the kitchen. "Sarah." Her daughter looked at her mother and immediately noticed something different in her expression. It wasn't anxiety. It was resolve. "What is it, Mom?" "Silas and Arthur have a plan," Mrs. Martha said, in the low voice a person uses when they are sure of what they are saying and don't want the words to travel beyond where they need to go. "I heard part of their conversation at the general store. Silas is going to file a formal written demand. He's going to force the sale of the remaining cattle as partial payment for the debt." Sarah set down the screwdriver slowly. "Why is Arthur involved in this?" "Because if you lose the cattle, the land becomes dead land, and dead land you'll have to sell. Arthur wants to buy it." "Arthur never needed my land for anything. His property is 10 times bigger." "Yeah, that's why I found it strange, too." The two of them stood in silence for a moment, looking at each other in the shed that smelled of dry wood and machine oil. There was something in that silence that hadn't been there before. The two of them together against something, not against each other. "How long do you think I have before the papers arrive?" Sarah asked. "Days, maybe a week." Sarah went to the crate where she kept the notebooks with the accounts and notes, grabbed one with a worn brown paper cover, and sat down on the floor of the shed with her back against the wall. Mrs. Martha stood for a moment, looking at her daughter sitting on the floor with the notebook in her lap, then went to get the low stool that was behind the door and sat down beside her. "Tell me what you're thinking," her mother said. Sarah looked at her with the expression of someone who took a second to process that her mother had asked that, because it wasn't what her mother usually asked for. Normally, her mother told her what she was thinking. She didn't ask to listen. "There's a rancher," Sarah began, opening the notebook. "Elias Thorne. He used to have property on the other side of that hill, and he abandoned it 2 years ago when his family left. I heard he still holds on to the land, didn't sell it, just stopped, and that he's open to talk." "Talk about what?" "If I can get a pasture rental agreement with him, temporary, I transfer the cattle. The cattle leave my property legally as a rental, not a sale. Then when Silas tries to seize them, the cattle won't be here to be taken." Mrs. Martha kept looking at the notebook, at the numbers her daughter had scribbled there, at the handwriting she had inherited from her father, slanted and firm in the curves. "You thought of this before I spoke." "I thought of it 3 days ago. I just needed to know if it was urgent enough to go see him tomorrow." "It's urgent," Mrs. Martha said firmly. "Go tomorrow." The next morning, Sarah left Caleb and her mother to take care of the property and drove the pickup truck to the other side of the hill. The property of Elias Thorne sat in a lowland that had been good land before the drought, and there was something sad about passing through the open gate and seeing the dry brush overtaking what had once been pasture. Elias was home, or in what was left of home, a brick building that held the basic furniture but gave off that air of a place that misses the people who truly lived in it. He was 57 years old, with broad shoulders hunched under the weight of a defeat he still hadn't fully digested, a few days' worth of beard, and the eyes of someone who distrusts everything from the outside, because everything from the outside had brought trouble so far. When Sarah climbed down from the pickup, he stood at the entrance of the house with his arms crossed, a posture that wasn't aggressive but wasn't welcoming either. "Sarah Miller," he said, more as a statement than a greeting. "Good morning, Elias. May I sit?" "There's a bench outside." They sat on the small porch with 2 glasses of water he fetched without offering anything else, and Sarah got straight to the point, because she knew beating around the bush wouldn't work with that man. "I need a pasture deal. Temporary. You rent me the leftover pasture here, I transfer my cattle for a set period, and when things change, we split the future produce in a fair way." Elias stared at her with that expression of someone waiting for the rest, the catch, the bad part. "Change how?" "When it rains," she said, with a simplicity that was either courage or madness, depending on how you looked at it. He did something she hadn't expected. He laughed. It wasn't Arthur's laugh, which was condescending. It was the laugh of someone who recognizes a situation because they've been in it. "When it rains," he repeated. "Do you know when that'll be?" "No, but I know it will." "How do you know?" "Because it always has rained. It always will rain. What I don't know is if I'll have land and cattle when it does." Elias was quiet for a long time, staring at the dry pasture beyond the porch. Sarah didn't push. She let the silence do the work that words sometimes can't. "No," he said finally. "I can't. Not now." Sarah nodded, got up, thanked him for the water, and left, without insisting, without showing how much that no had weighed on her. On the way back, she drove past the property and stopped the pickup at the edge of the dry creek bed. She got out, walked slowly along the black tarp that gleamed under the afternoon sun, and stood looking at that length of black plastic over the cracked earth. There was something in the image she couldn't put into words but felt clearly. That tarp was an argument, not in favor of an idea, in favor of a possibility, and arguments need to be shown, not just spoken. She went home, walked over to the drawer where she kept scraps of wrapping paper, and spent the afternoon drawing. She wasn't an architect, wasn't an engineer, hadn't even finished high school before having to stop to help her father on the land. But she had understood the logic of what she was doing with a precision that came from weeks of study, and what she drew in those hours at the kitchen table was a hand-drawn map with estimated measurements and arrows showing the flow of water, how the same tarp system could be adapted to the topography of Elias's property. It wasn't a promise, it was a possibility drawn on paper. The next morning she went back to Elias's property with Caleb by her side and 2-gallon jugs of water in the pickup bed, not because there was water to spare, but because going empty-handed on a second visit seemed wrong. Elias opened the door with an expression that said he hadn't expected to see her again so soon. "Sarah." "Good morning." "I brought something for you to see." She spread the map out on the table outside, holding the edges down with the glasses of water, and stayed quiet while he looked at it. Caleb stood a step back with his hands in his pockets. Elias leaned over the paper, ran a finger along the arrow showing the flow, and looked at the topography she had drawn from memory with a precision that surprised him. "Did you measure this by hand?" "By eye and by pacing it out, but it can be adjusted." "And does it work?" "It works on my land. It might work on yours too." Elias stared at the map for a long time without speaking. His nephew, Owen, a 22-year-old who had arrived at the property 2 days earlier for a visit and had been listening to the conversation from the doorstep, came down the steps and looked at the map over his uncle's shoulder. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the paper. "Go ahead," Sarah said. Owen picked up the map and studied it with a different kind of attention than his uncle. He was an agronomy major in his final year, had grown up listening to his uncle talk about the land with that mix of love and despair that drought brought to those who stayed, and there was something in what he saw on that map that made him want to understand more. "Where's the cistern you dug?" he asked. "About 50 yards below this curve here," she pointed out on the paper. "And you said the water collected after the first light rain." "More than we expected," she confirmed. Owen looked at his uncle. Elias held the map in his hand for a moment, then folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. "Give me until tomorrow to think it over," he said. It was different from a no, and it was different from yesterday's no. But when Sarah got home and found Mrs. Martha waiting on the porch with an expression she knew well, the one of someone with bad news choosing their words, her stomach dropped. "A man came by," her mother said quietly. "What man?" "From the county records office. He brought a document. I asked for 24 hours before signing anything. He said he'd be back tomorrow." Sarah climbed the porch steps slowly, sat in the chair where her father had sat for decades, and stared at the document her mother held in her hand with the precision of someone keeping something dangerous. She read it calmly, word for word. When she finished, she folded it and sat still with the folded paper in her hands on her lap. "He moved faster," she said. "Silas." "Faster than I thought." The deadline in the document was shorter than she had calculated. There weren't weeks left. There were days, and if Elias didn't answer tomorrow with a clear yes, the alternative she had built on paper would collapse before it could even be tested. That night, for the first time since she'd bought the tarp, Sarah didn't sleep. She sat in the porch chair looking up at the dark sky of the drylands, which was the way it got when the drought was at its worst. Such a deep, clear blue it seemed like a lie, with too many stars, as if the universe was showing off its normalcy while everything below dried up. She stayed there until almost dawn, her bare feet on the wooden floorboards, her arms crossed over her chest, her thoughts spinning in circles without finding a way out. At some point, the door creaked. Mrs. Martha appeared with a shawl over her shoulders and 2 cups of tea, without saying a word. She sat in the other chair and handed one of the cups over. The two of them looked out into the dark for a long time without speaking, drinking the tea that cooled quickly in the dawn breeze. "He'll call tomorrow with a yes," Mrs. Martha said suddenly, with a conviction that had no basis other than what a mother sometimes feels. "You don't know that." "I don't, but I'm saying it anyway." Sarah looked at her mother sideways, and for the first time in a long while she felt something that wasn't exactly lightness, because lightness was out of reach, but it was close to comfort. "Thank you, Mom," she said. "For what?" "I didn't do anything." She stayed here. Mrs. Martha didn't answer. She took the last sip of tea and stared at the sky. And it was true that she had stayed, that it was that simple, and that sometimes simple like that is all a person needs to get through the night. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to hit like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. The next morning, Sarah woke up in the porch chair with a stiff neck and the sun in her face. Mrs. Martha had gone back inside at some point during the night and had left a folded blanket over her daughter's legs, a small gesture that Sarah noticed when she opened her eyes and that stayed with her, carrying a weight different from an ordinary blanket. The early morning silence of the drylands was the kind that presses down, the silence of a place waiting for something that hasn't arrived yet. The yard chickens hadn't started their daily hustle, and the wind was still, as if the air itself were holding its breath. At 8 in the morning the phone rang. It was Elias. "You can bring the cattle," he said, "but there's a condition. Before I sign any papers, I want to see the tarp system in place, me and Owen. When do you want to come?" "This afternoon, if you can." "I can." She hung up the phone, stood in the kitchen for a second with her hand still on the receiver, and then went to wake Caleb. Elias arrived at 3 in the afternoon with Owen by his side, both in the old pickup truck that rumbled from a distance in the silence of the dirt road. Mrs. Martha stayed at the house. Sarah and Caleb went to the gate to greet them, and then the 4 of them walked down to the creek bed without much talk. Elias walked along the tarp with his hands in his pockets, looking at the ground, looking at the edges, looking at how the land sloped gently toward the cistern that Sarah and Caleb had dug. Sarah explained what was needed without embellishment, using words from the pamphlet she had studied, mixed with those she had discovered on her own in the process of doing it. Owen walked a bit behind, slower, with that look of someone seeing one thing while thinking of another. He stopped at a certain part of the creek bed longer than the rest, crouched down, rubbed the dry soil between his fingers with a particular attention. "This soil here is different," he said, almost to himself. "What do you mean different?" Sarah asked. "The texture, it's more clay-like than it seems on the surface. This holds moisture in a way the surrounding land doesn't." He stared at the dirt in the palm of his hand. "That's why your tarp works so well with such a weak rain. The soil under the tarp doesn't let the water infiltrate too fast. It builds up here before heading down to the cistern." "Is that good?" Caleb asked. "It's very good," Owen said. "This type of soil with this composition usually indicates that underneath there's a layer that retains water much longer than normal. It's land with special characteristics." There was a silence. Sarah looked at the dry creek bed around her with a different attention, as if she were seeing something for the first time, that had been there her whole life without being noticed. "Are you saying this creek didn't just dry up because of the drought?" she said slowly. "I'm saying it will probably come back before the others. When it rains, this stretch will collect water, with an efficiency the other creek beds around here won't have. Whoever did the original survey of this area must have noticed that." Elias stopped walking and turned to his nephew. "Who did a survey here?" Owen stood still. "Before I went to study when I was about 15, do you remember a man who came to measure the land here in the community? He was an irrigation technician. Don't you remember he passed through here?" "I remember a man who came by measuring things, but I don't know who sent it." Sarah felt something stir inside her chest. It wasn't quite certainty, but a suspicion slowly taking shape, like water finding its way. "What was this technician's name?" she asked. "Thomas Avery," Owen replied. "I remember because he explained what he was doing when I asked. I was a kid. I thought it was interesting." Sarah stared at the dry creek bed for a moment. "Thomas Avery," she repeated, tucking the name away. Elias squeezed her hand before leaving. The deal was sealed. The cattle would be moved the next morning with a document signed by a witness within the bounds of the law. When their trucks disappeared around the bend in the road, Sarah stood alone in the creek bed for a moment, looking at the tarp, at the clay soil Owen had pointed out, at the cistern she and her son had dug with their own hands. A question had been growing slowly inside her ever since Owen had mentioned the technician's name and the land survey. It wasn't a question she liked having, but it was a question that needed an answer. The next morning, the clerk from the county records office returned as promised. Sarah received him on the porch with the agreement with Elias in hand, signed and witnessed, along with a written response to Silas's demand that she and her mother had drafted the night before at the kitchen table, using the brown paper notebook and an old dictionary left over from the time her father had tried to learn to write better. The clerk read everything, jotted notes on his own paper, and left without managing to take what he'd come for. After he was gone, Caleb stepped off the porch and stood by his mother. "Did we pull it off?" he asked. "For now," she replied. "But it's not over." And it wasn't. Because that same afternoon, Mr. Arthur Sterling went to Silas's general store and learned the strategy had failed. The cattle were no longer on the property to be seized. Sarah had responded in writing, and the county clerk had come back empty-handed. Arthur left the store with an expression no one in town had ever seen on him before. It wasn't ordinary anger. It was the look of someone who had miscalculated something he'd planned for a long time. In the days that followed, the pressure shifted shape. Arthur began openly gossiping in the community that the deal with Elias was a fabrication, that there was no such document, that Sarah was making up a way out to buy time before selling. The rumor was just the right size to slip through any crack. A distant relative who lived on the property and helped with the chores left, saying he didn't want to get mixed up in troubled land. Two neighbors who used to wave at Sarah on the road started looking away. Caleb felt all of this in a way Sarah only noticed when he came to her one morning and spoke more than he had in weeks combined. "Mom, I need to tell you something." She was mending the edge of the tarp that had come loose overnight and stopped. "Go ahead." "I'm tired." He said it in a voice that held no anger, only weight. "Not tired of working. Tired of watching you work every day without stopping and hearing people say it's made up, that it'll fail, that it's crazy. I'm tired of being afraid they might be right." Sarah looked at her son for a moment. There was an honesty in that which hurt in a good way, the kind of pain that comes when someone speaks the truth. "Come here," she said. The two of them walked over to the cistern. Sarah pointed inside. There was more water than the week before, because it had drizzled 3 days earlier, a weak, brief rain that under normal circumstances wouldn't have left a trace on dry ground, but the tarp had channeled it all there. Caleb looked at the water at the bottom of the cistern in silence. "You've grown," he said. "You've grown." She didn't say anything else for a while. "Caleb, I'm not sure if this will work. I know it might not. But this water at the bottom exists because we did something while everyone else said we were crazy. If it fails, at least we tried with what we had. If it works, no one will be able to say it was luck." The boy kept staring at the water for a while longer. Then he went to get the tools and came back to work beside her without saying another word. But there was something different in the way he carried things after that conversation, a resolve that tasted like choice, not obligation. In the days that followed, the sky began to change. It was a subtle change, the kind that only those who truly know the dry lands notice before it becomes a topic of conversation. The clouds that appeared at dusk started to take on a different color. They were no longer those high, white clouds that promised nothing. Clouds with dark underbellies began to show on the western horizon, arriving, making a promise and leaving. But they left behind a different humidity in the air, a smell that the dry earth had forgotten. Mrs. Martha noticed and spent more time than usual looking at the horizon in the afternoons. She had extended her stay without announcing it, without apologizing, just staying. She began to help Sarah and Caleb reinforce the edges of the tarp with larger stones she carried from the ravine, slowly, at a pace her 68-year-old body allowed. She didn't complain. She didn't compare it to what could have been done differently. She just worked. There came an afternoon when the three generations, the mother, the daughter, and the son, were along the creek bed, each in a different section, securing the edges of the tarp for what seemed like a bigger rain approaching, and Mrs. Martha stopped for a moment, looked at the two figures along the bed, and had to press her lips together to keep what she was feeling from spilling out in front of everyone. It was that week that Sarah decided to go find Thomas Avery. She had asked Owen over the phone where the technician lived, and Owen had consulted the notes from the notebook he had as a child and found the name of a town 3 hours away where the man had said he worked for a rural consulting firm. Sarah went alone, on a morning that seemed like any other, leaving Caleb and her mother on the property. Thomas Avery was 54 years old and worked in a small room above an accounting office with land maps pinned to the wall with pushpins and a desk covered in papers with measurements and contour lines. He was a thin man with thin glasses and the expression of someone who had spent a lifetime measuring things that other people couldn't see. When Sarah walked in and said the name of the Clear Springs community, he looked up from his papers with an attention she hadn't expected. "Clear Springs," he repeated. "I know it." "I know you do," she said, sitting in the chair in front of him without being invited because there was no time for formality. "You did a land survey there about 7 or 8 years ago. I need to know what you found." Thomas looked at her for a moment. "Who sent you here?" "A conversation I had with an agronomy student. He mentioned the soil of the creek bed on my property and your name at the same time, and I've learned that when two things come together like that, it's no coincidence." He was quiet, rubbed his face, went to the shelf by the window, and started searching among the old files. After a moment, he pulled out a faded brown folder. "I did the survey," he said, without opening the folder yet. "I was hired by a landowner in the area." "Which landowner?" He opened the folder. There was a contract sheet on the first page. He turned it for her to see. The name on the contract was Arthur Sterling. Sarah stared at the name for a time that felt longer than it was. The pieces that had been scattered for weeks clicked together with a sound that wasn't audible, but that she felt in the center of her chest, like a revelation that didn't want to be a surprise, but was. "What did the survey show?" she asked, her voice calmer than she felt inside. Thomas Avery opened the folder wider, showing the terrain map he had drawn years ago. He pointed to a specific area on the map, and Sarah recognized it immediately. It was exactly where the creek bed of the Miller property lay, the same stretch she had covered with the tarp, the same clay soil that Owen had noticed. "Here," he said, his voice serious but careful. "Underneath this section of the creek bed, there's an impermeable clay layer that acts as a natural underground dam. It's what we call a perched water table. Under normal conditions, it's what fed the spring and the creek. With the prolonged drought, the level dropped, but the structure is intact. When the rain returns, this area will fill up in a completely different way from the surrounding land. It's one of the best positioned underground water reserves I've mapped in this region." Sarah kept staring at the map. "And Arthur knows about it." "Arthur commissioned this survey," Thomas said carefully. "I don't know what he did with the information, but yes, he received this report." "Why did he want to know that? His property is on the other side of the boundary." His property is on the other side, yes, but the water table doesn't respect fence lines. The easiest access to that water reserve, the point where it's possible to drill an artesian well reaching the deepest layer, is in your creek bed. The silence that followed was one of those that a person would need a long time to describe, because within it there was anger, there was clarity, there was relief from understanding what had been happening, and there was also something harder to name, the realization that she had been right, without knowing exactly why she was right. "Can you put that in writing?" she asked. "I can. It's my original report. I have the right to make it available to the owner of the studied land. I am the owner of the land." Thomas closed the folder, looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone weighing a decision. "Are you going to use this in some specific way?" "I'm going to use it to make sure the land my father built remains mine." He stood up, walked over to the old copier in the corner of the room, made a copy of the full report, and handed it to her with the copy of the original contract on top, where Arthur's name was. Sarah drove back to Clear Springs with that envelope on the passenger seat, and her mind working in silence during the 3-hour drive. When she arrived, it was nearly dusk. She went inside, placed the envelope on the kitchen table, and stood in front of it for a moment. Mrs. Martha appeared from the living room. "How did it go?" "I found out why Arthur wants this land," Sarah said. Her mother stared at the envelope. "Tell me." Sarah told her everything. Mrs. Martha listened while sitting in the chair, her hands on the table, and an expression that slowly shifted from astonishment to something like the grim satisfaction of someone who understands that the suspicion she'd had from the start was well-founded. "He knew about the water," her mother said when Sarah finished. "He knew, and he waited for the drought to last long enough to force me to sell cheap. And Silas. Silas probably doesn't know about the water. He was being used. Or maybe he knew and was promised a cut, it doesn't matter." Mrs. Martha was quiet for a moment. "And now? Now I have the report that proves what's underneath this land. I'm not going anywhere with this. I'm not going to accuse anyone of anything. I'm going to use this in a way that works for me, making sure this land never leaves our family's hands." Caleb had come from the shed in the middle of the conversation and had heard enough to understand. He stood at the kitchen entrance with the expression of someone processing something big. He wanted to buy the land at the drought price, but what he was really buying was the water, the boy said slowly. "That's right. And the tarp you put over the creek bed. It's placed right over the exact spot where he wanted to dig the well." The three of them were silent for a moment. It was a different kind of silence than before, not fear or doubt, but understanding, and something that might have been the beginning of a victory that still hadn't fully come together. That dawn, the rain arrived. It came without warning, the way the dry land sometimes does when it decides to end the suffering all at once. Not with a gentle drizzle, but with real rain, heavy, steady. That kind of noise on the clay roof that wakes everyone up, and that the community had forgotten what it sounded like. The noise on the tarp was the first thing Sarah heard, a heavy, continuous drumming that she recognized before she even opened her eyes completely. She got up in the dark. Mrs. Martha was already in the living room. Caleb came out of the bedroom door with half-closed eyes and the expression of someone who doesn't know if they're awake or dreaming. "The tarp," Sarah said. The three of them ran. In the rain, in the dark, with the flashlights Sarah had left by the door from planning for that moment so much, without knowing when it would come. The creek bed was already different, the water running over the tarp in streams that joined together, flowing down the natural slope of the land toward the reservoir, with a speed and volume that none of the three had calculated for such a rain. Sarah stood at the edge of the creek bed with the flashlight pointed at the tarp, soaked from head to toe, and said nothing. Caleb stood beside her. Mrs. Martha stood a step behind, her hand resting on her daughter's shoulder, without either of them noticing exactly when that had happened. They were three figures standing in the heavy rain, lit by flashlights dripping water, looking at a black tarp that had been a source of ridicule and was now doing exactly what it had been promised to do, with an efficiency that exceeded anything any of them had expected. Caleb went to the edge of the reservoir with the flashlight. He turned to his mother. "It's overflowing," he said in a voice that carried something he couldn't fully hold back. Sarah looked at her son for a moment. Then her gaze went to the reservoir, to the tarp, to the rain that kept falling, to the creek bed that had been dry for 14 months and now carried real water for the first time. She didn't cry, but she stood there for too long for someone who wasn't feeling anything. Mrs. Martha held her daughter's hand in the rain, and Sarah let her. In the days that followed, the rain continued, sometimes light, sometimes heavy, but never fully stopping, as if the drylands were compensating with interest for what it had withheld for 14 months. The community of Clear Springs woke up different in those days. The residents who had stayed, who hadn't sold and left, started showing up at each other's gates with that expression of people who had survived something together, needing to look each other in the eye to be sure it wasn't a dream. There were conversations on the dirt road that hadn't happened in recent months, a lightness returning slowly, like color coming back to the landscape when water touches the dry earth. The reservoir overflowed, and the excess began to feed a ditch that Caleb had spontaneously dug following the slope of the land, as if the boy had understood on his own what the water needed to have done. The creek bed had water flowing through it again, not much, not like before, but visible water, that made noise that reflected the afternoon light, and that the birds soon found. Elias Thorne showed up at the property on a Saturday morning to check on what he had promised in the agreement, and stood still for a long time looking at the bed with the expression of someone who is reconsidering a belief. Owen came along, and this time spent hours walking along the bed, collecting soil samples, jotting down notes in a new notebook. When he left, he told Sarah that he was going to include the Tarp system in a project he was doing for his course. "Can I mention you?" he asked. "You can mention the idea," she replied. "The idea belongs to whoever needed it." Thomas Avery showed up 3 days later, not because Sarah had called him, but because he had heard about what was happening at Clear Springs through Owen, who had called him to ask questions about the land survey. He arrived by car, with the maps from the brown folder, and walked along the creek bed with a professional calm that was occasionally interrupted by an expression that resembled admiration. "It worked out better than the terrain suggested on paper," he said to Sarah, who was walking beside him. "This is real results. We needed results. I'd like to present this at a producers' meeting happening at the county seat next month, with your permission. You can present the system. The survey report I have with me, that one I'm keeping." Thomas nodded, understanding the message, and didn't ask anything else about the report. It was late that same week when Thomas had been there that Silas Vance showed up at the property with a completely different attitude from all the other times. He arrived slowly, stopped the pickup truck without raising dust, and came up onto the porch with his hat in his hand, which was a difference Sarah noticed immediately. "Sarah," he began, sitting in the chair she had gestured toward. "Good afternoon, Silas. I came to—" He paused, started over. "The situation has changed. I know that, and I think we can renegotiate the terms in a way that's more reasonable for you." Sarah looked at him with a calm that cost more than it showed. "We can renegotiate, yes," she said, "but you'll be negotiating with someone who has the land, the cattle, and the water, not with someone who's desperate to sell. Those are different conditions." Silas looked at her, and there was in that expression of his a recognition that the ground had shifted beneath his feet. "I know," he said. "So start over with fair terms, and we'll talk." The negotiation that followed was long, took place over 2 visits, and ended with terms that Sarah could meet without having to sell anything. Silas left with less than he had counted on when he got into the scheme with Arthur. Her son, who had watched both conversations from the kitchen window, came to talk to his mother after Silas left the second time. "Did you know he was going to give in?" Caleb asked. "I knew that when the ground changes, someone who was betting on the drought has to renegotiate." "And what about Arthur?" Sarah looked at her son for a second. "Arthur will show up, in his own way." And he did show up on a Saturday morning, exactly as she had said, without sending word and without warning. He arrived at the gate with his hat in his hand, for real this time, not just in the gesture but in his whole demeanor. A different posture, a different expression. The smile that had been there for weeks was gone. Sarah walked to the gate without hurrying. Mr. Arthur. Sarah. He looked at the creek bed in the distance, where the water was flowing slowly and the green was beginning to appear along the banks. May I see? She opened the gate. The two of them walked along the bed in silence for a long time. Arthur was looking at the tarp, at the cistern, at the soil around him that was changing color, at the thin stream of water flowing slowly. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. That really helps us, who are just starting out. Now, continuing. I had a survey done here, Arthur finally said, with a voice like someone setting down a weight after carrying it for a long time. A few years back, I knew what was under this stream bed. Sarah didn't feign surprise. I know, she said. He turned to her with an expression she had never seen on him before, one made up of things too complex for a single look to hold. You know. I have the report. Thomas Avery gave me a copy. There was a silence. Arthur looked at the stream bed for a moment, then at the horizon where the sky was that blue that only appears after rain, a blue the community had forgotten was so beautiful. I wasn't going to do anything wrong, he said slowly. I was just going to buy the land when you needed to sell. It was a deal. It was a deal that depended on me being forced to sell, she replied without anger, with the precision of someone stating a fact. That's not the same thing. Arthur fell quiet. There was in his expression an inner battle he wasn't winning, and Sarah could see it with the clarity of someone who had already fought her own many times. My pasture land is running out, he said finally. I don't have enough water for the herd, I know that. Your nephew, that Owen, he knows where you'd have to dig a well for the water table under my land, on the other side of the boundary line. My nephew isn't my nephew. He's Elias Thorne's nephew. He knows where it is just the same. Sarah stared at Arthur for a moment. He was a 62-year-old man who had spent his life taking what his father had left behind and treating it as if it were earned. And there he stood, hat in hand, because the drought had reached even what he thought was safe. Whenever you want to talk about it, she said, send Caleb over. He learned the Tarp system from start to finish and can help adapt it for your land, if the topography allows. Arthur looked at her. Why would you do that? Because that's what we do here, she replied simply. Clear Springs is the name of the place, not anyone's property. He left the property without saying another word. But there was something in the way he closed the gate, carefully where before he had slammed it, that was different from everything that had come before. Caleb had watched the end of the conversation through the window. When his mother came inside, he was in the kitchen with the look of someone who has something on the tip of their tongue. You're going to tell me to help him, if he asks. After everything he did? Sarah thought for a moment, sat down in the kitchen chair and looked at her hands, each callus carrying months of work. Caleb, your grandfather used to say something I took a while to understand. He said the land doesn't hold a grudge, that it takes rain from any direction it comes. She looked at her son. I'm no better than the land. The boy was quiet for a moment, processing that with the kind of 15-year-old seriousness that ran deeper than it seemed. Okay, he said. If he asks, I'll go. On the morning of the producers' meeting at the county seat, Sarah woke up before everyone else. She went to the kitchen window, looked at the bed of the creek, which from there already showed the green edge the water had brought back, and stood there for a time she couldn't measure. Mrs. Martha was making coffee when she turned. Going in your new shirt? Her mother asked. I only have the blue one I wear every day. Then go in your blue shirt, and you'll look just as pretty. The two of them drank their coffee in silence, that good silence made of comfort and not of words left unspoken. When Sarah reached for the truck keys, her mother held her arm for a second. Your father would be proud, Mrs. Martha said, with a voice that had kept those words locked away for a long time before she could say them. Sarah stood still with her hand on the keys for a moment. She nodded, set her jaw like someone holding something they won't let fall, and went. The meeting was held in a town hall, with plastic chairs and a ceiling fan spinning without conviction. There were about 40 people, men and women from different parts of the region, most wearing the expression of those who still carried the weight of the drought on their shoulders, even with the rain that had come. Thomas Avery was there with the maps. Owen was at his side with the notebook. Elias Thorne had come too, sitting in the second row with his nephew. When Thomas presented the Tarp system, with the maps of the Clear Springs land and the data on what had happened to the cistern, a silence fell over the room that wasn't the silence of boredom. It was the silence of people hearing something that was shifting a belief. Questions started coming. Thomas answered some, and for others, he pointed to Sarah, who was sitting in the third row and had thought she was just going to listen. She answered each question with the language of someone who learned by doing, without hard terms, without showing off, with the precision of someone who had spent weeks studying pamphlets by lamplight, because understanding was necessary to get things done. And in that room, there was a gradual change in the way people looked at her, not as the woman who had covered the creek with a tarp and whom everyone had thought was crazy, but as someone who had found an answer at a time when the question was harder than anyone had been able to face. When she left, the sun was high in the sky and the heat was that honest kind the drylands has when it's back to its normal version. Not the punishing heat of the drought, but the heat that is part of the place. She went to the truck, stood beside it for a moment with her hand on the door, and looked at the horizon where the distant mountains were greener than they had been in weeks. There was something she knew at that moment that she hadn't known in the same way before. Not as head knowledge, but as something known from within. That resisting wasn't stubbornness for its own sake. It was knowing what was worth it and not giving up before trying everything there was to try. Her father had done that his whole life. She had done it for 14 months of drought, one tarp at a time from every roll, one rock at a time on every edge, one word at a time said calmly to those who mocked. The Miller land was hers. The cistern was full. The son, who had once said he was tired of being afraid she was wrong, now woke up before sunrise to check the water level with a quiet pride he still couldn't name out loud, but that Sarah saw in the set of his shoulders when he came back from the creek bed, the flashlight still in his hand. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The end. Now, tell us what you thought of this story and where you're watching us from. Did Sarah touch you in some way? Leave it in the comments. Your like and subscription to the channel mean a lot to us who are just starting out. Thank you so much for your company.